Well, we want to welcome everyone to our CAC meeting this afternoon, and we're honored to welcome Richard Maddy, who's Professor of Anthropology here. And Richard's title today is Osler and the iPad, the Evolution of Medicine in the 21st Century. Thank you very much.
It could be informal. American medicine has kind of a patchwork beginning. It started out as an apprenticeship system, really based on the old European guilds, where a young person would apprentice themselves to a practicing physician and ostensibly learn what that physician knew and pick up a little tidbit here and there, a few pearls. But if you were looking for a formally trained physician in America, there were very few and far between. There were some, but it took a lot of money for them to get that type of training. And they typically had to go to Europe to get it. And the medical schools, first of Scotland, and then of France and Germany and Austria. And that's sort of in chronological order, because the medical schools in Scotland were favored in the 1700s, and as we got into the beginning of the 1800s, the font of medical knowledge shifted over to France. And then about 1840, the German and the Austrian schools started to come online. First medical school that we had in the United States was University of Pennsylvania. It was founded in 1765. They had a group of physicians, there were about 13 of them that would give lectures. They advertised they were giving anatomical lectures and a course on the theory of and practice of physics. So that was the way that they taught medicine back then. And most of these physicians that were teaching at the University of Pennsylvania at the time had been educated in Europe, so they were not slouches by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, it was still basically a proprietary school. The physicians who taught there were paid a fee. They weren't full-time faculty. We didn't have anything like full-time faculty in medical schools back at that time. And so they had private practices that they maintained, which were fairly large. And then in their spare time, they taught medical students, and these medical students that were being taught formally in the classroom were also doing the apprenticeship with them and following them around, seeing patients. And the majority of the medical schools in the 18th and 19th century were proprietary schools owned by physicians. There were very few of them that were actually attached to universities. University of Pennsylvania was one. Harvard opened one in the early 1800s. And as did Yale and Princeton, but the majority of them were just private medical schools. There weren't any full-time faculty positions that existed in any of these schools prior to 1892. So they were all working part-time. Now American medicine's underpinnings had several philosophical beginnings. I put Cos versus Nidus here. This is Hippocrates versus Asclepius. You had.
I knew that.
I knew you did.
But I didn't.
See, Quentin will admit it. All philosophers do. But Hippocrates, or as we used to say in Greek plays, Hippocrates, versus the cult of Asclepius. And Hippocrates took the religion out of medicine. The Asclepians thought, that this is, the gods are angry with you, and we have to placate the gods, and we have to do all these other things to get things back in balance. Hippocrates, a believer in humoral medicine, but nonetheless he thought that we have to find the organic cause, the material cause of medicine, of disease. And he was his group was really the first group to do that and to attribute some biological abnormality to something other than the fact that Zeus was mad at you. Giovanni Organi was an Italian physician from whom we got the idea of physical diagnosis. He lived in the mid-1700s, and he went so far as to say that symptoms, symptomology that you would get from a disease is the cry of the suffering organs. You know, we need to listen to what the patient is saying, and this is going to lead us to the cause of the problem. And then we have our friend René Théophile Hyacinthe-Laennec. He's a diminutive little 5'2" Frenchman who taught physical diagnosis at the Hospital Neckar. And he was taking his students around one day and diagnosing patients in the hospital. Was the practice in France at the time. You take a group of students with you and they follow you around and you see actual cases in the hospital. Well, it comes upon this really attractive 19-year-old girl who was buxom, also filthy at the time, and she was complaining of a respiratory problem. Well, the practice at the time to listen to the lungs or listen to the heart was to put the ear up against the chest. Well, he's got 6 male students with him. This seems a little inappropriate for the time. This woman, especially the way that she was built and also the way she smelled. And so he dismisses the class and he's walking home. And he sees these little kids playing a game that he's played many times as a young boy. One of them has a long piece of wood, and he has it up next to his friend's ear, and he's scratching on the end of it, and his friend is listening through that to see what he can hear through it. And he says to himself probably something like, "Sacre bleu, I've got it." And he goes back to the hospital, he takes his notebook and he rolls it up, and he puts it up against her chest, and he can hear everything. So he goes home. He liked to do woodwork. And he made a hollow cylinder in 2 pieces so that he could take it apart, put it in his top hat, and take it with him. And he called it his cylindre, or his baton. And that's where we got the stethoscope. That was the first thing that put distance between the patient and the physician. Now we come to our German friend Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, who puts even more distance between the patient and the physician, because he's got a light that nobody can see, but it can see inside of you. And it can image things that are internal, and this is where physicians first start to get the idea that there are constituent parts to a patient that maybe I can separate in my mind, and I no longer think of them as the patient. I think of them as the sum total of these parts that I see here. And we fast forward with all of this medical knowledge that we've gained to about 1892, actually 1889. The philanthropist Johns Hopkins died in 1873. Left a big grant for a university to be built in Baltimore, and it was his desire that a medical school be attached to it. So the Johns Hopkins Hospital was opened in 1889, and the medical school opened in 1892 after it received some additional funding. And with that additional funding came a stipulation that if you're going to admit patients, or if you're going to admit students, you have to admit females, which was very unusual back then. It was a grant from a very wealthy lady named Mary Garrett. Well, Hopkins, the physicians at Hopkins who started it had all been trained in these previous ideas of medicine. There were European ideas, clearly, from Organi, Laennec, and Röntgen. And they placed a high value on science. And each one of them had been educated in Germany. So they had in their mind this German model, and that's the model that they set up at Hopkins. There you had the 4 founding physicians. Here, this is in the back here, William Stewart Halsted. This is the actual first physician there, William Henry Welch. This is Howard Atwood Kelly, who was a gynecologist. And this is Sir William Osler. He was the person that we look to as the father of American medicine. Now, William Henry Welch was a pathologist. He's known for being the mentor and educator of Walter Reed. He was instrumental in organizing research for the great influenza pandemic of 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic. And he also had the distinction of kicking Gertrude Stein out of medical school. He said she was never going to be a doctor. Now, William Stewart Halsted, he was their professor of surgery. He was the first person in the United States to use rubber gloves. He was operating one time, and he said his nurse was a very efficient woman. And he noticed that the carbolic acid that he was using to clean the instruments was irritating her hands. So he contacted the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company and asked them to make him some tight-fitting gloves with gauntlets that went up to the elbow for both himself and for his nurse. And they worked great. And you kind of have to read between the lines when he referred to her as a very efficient woman, because apparently there was more going on there because she became Mrs. Halsted a little bit later. He invented the Radical Mastectomy, which at the time was revolutionary. I mean, it saved lives. Breast cancer was a death sentence in the early 1900s. You just basically went home to die. Halsted researched anatomy and did the operation on several experimental animals before, just to see what can I do with the chest area, and came up with a radical mastectomy and saved innumerable lives. Today we don't do it, it's considered archaic. We do what they consider radical mastectomy today is basically taking out all of the tissue inside the breast and replacing it with a prosthesis, and you don't even know that it's taken place. He was the trainer of Harvey Cushing. Harvey Cushing went on to Yale, and became the chief of neurosurgery. He was our first neurosurgeon. And then Howard Atwood Kelly, he was the OBGYN, had the department of OBGYN. He invented the cystoscope. If you've ever had cystoscopy, he's the one to blame for this, where you can look right up the ureter. He was the first one to use radium to treat ovarian cancer. He was also, interestingly enough, an evangelical Christian, and Mark, you'll remember the book, The Fundamentals. He actually contributed an article to that. So he was a fundamentalist. The other 3 doctors thought he was kind of weird, but he stayed there in Hopkins until he was in his 70s. And then, of course, our friend Sir William Osler, who we refer to as the father of modern medicine, wrote the first definitive textbook on medicine, principles, and the practice of medicine. And for his work, was asked to come over to England to become the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. He was Canadian by birth, and so therefore he could be knighted by the king, and he was back in late 1911. Now Hopkins, these 4 physicians set Hopkins up as the model, as a model medical school, and they planned it after the German model. And in Germany, medical students were receiving didactic education for the first 2 years of medical school. It was all in classroom. The second 2 years, the students were put out on the wards in the hospital, And they learned by applying what they had learned the first 2 years to patient care. So you had the first 2 years didactic, second 2 years caring for patients. And Hopkins became fairly well known for that. Well, in the early 1900s in the United States and Canada, we had 155 medical schools, most of them proprietary, and most of them terrible. You could go straight into medical school from high school. You didn't have to have a college education. Hopkins was the first place to require a 4-year degree before you could get in. Well, the people at the Carnegie Foundation, particularly Andrew Carnegie, were interested in education. And they had done a definitive paper on the American college, whereby they ripped up most of the colleges in America and said they weren't doing their job and sort of put them on the straight and narrow. So why not do the same thing for medicine? And they did. They engaged a Johns Hopkins graduate, Abraham Flexner, to write what they called Bulletin Number 4. It was Medical Education in the United States and Canada. Their report for the Institute in the Advancement of Teaching on the state of medical education in the United States. And Flexner personally visited every single medical school in the United States and in Canada over a period of several years. And what he found was that there were 155 medical schools, of course, and 35 were salvageable. All the rest of them needed to be closed down or consolidated. And since Flexner went to Hopkins, and since his brother Simon Flexner had studied medicine there under William Osler, guess what he used as a model for the perfect medical school? Of course, it was Johns Hopkins. And he took the qualities of Johns Hopkins and imposed those on the 35 medical schools that were salvageable. And he said, we're going to give you 2 years to bring things up to standard. And if you can, you can survive. If you can't, you won't. And they did. And many of them consolidated, went together, but they, some of them were able to do it on their own. Schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth were all able to comply and come in line with the Hopkins Model. And the Hopkins Model is what is still instituted today in medical schools. Medical students today are taught during the first 2 years fully didactic courses, textbooks and lectures, with the one exception of gross anatomy, where they work on an actual cadaver. And then their last 2 years are spent on the wards in the hospital. Medicine has, over the years, it hasn't been static. It hasn't, of course, stayed with the technology that they had in 1892. As I said before, the stethoscope put distance between the patient and the physician. The X-ray put greater distance between the patient and the physician. And what we've done in terms of technology is continue on that path, putting a greater separation between the physician and the patient. For instance, this is the Da Vinci surgical robot. You have a patient that is draped here, lying on a table with 3 trocars inserted in the abdomen, through which they're able to run fiber optic instruments up through there. Now they can do surgery on the bladder, on the lung. They can do coronary bypass using the mammary artery and not break any ribs. And this is the surgeon sitting a few feet away, looking through a hood, not being able to see the patient's face, not standing over the patient, cutting through flesh. He's viewing it like you would view a video game, and he's got joysticks that he's operating these instruments with. So that's his view of the patient. This is another piece of equipment that we have that is being used, in Ronald Reagan Hospital at UCLA, and several on the West Coast, where you have the doctor in his or her office connected wirelessly to this robot. This robot travels up and down the aisles of the hospital into each room, and there's usually a nurse with an iPad following it. And in the back of that robot is the ability to hook the patient up to a heart monitor, to monitor their heart rate, to listen to their breathing, and it's all being transmitted real time back to the physician in his office, so he doesn't even have to leave the office. And if he has an iPad, he doesn't even have to leave the golf course. So it's interesting. I asked, one of the references on there is Sherwin Nuland, who wrote the book Doctors, the biography of medicine. He also wrote a book called How We Die, and one called How We Live. He was a medical ethicist, and I was communicating with him by email before he passed away. He just passed away this last March. And I asked him about, he was a surgeon, and I asked him about surgery this way. What do you think about that? And it's interesting what he wrote me back. He said, after a 40-year career in surgery, he said, these two approaches to the human body, he's talking about manual surgery versus robotic surgery, have, I believe, very little in common, requiring not merely different skill sets and different personalities to carry them out, but entirely different philosophies about the art of medicine, the wonders of nature, and aesthetics in general. I would never have chosen surgery as a career under the present circumstances. So it's like Marshall McLuhan said, tools basically are intermediate objects to help us accomplish a goal. But when McLuhan said we shape our tools and after that our tools shape us, he was absolutely right. And I don't think we realize the power of that statement. Because once we have come under the spell of something like this, this becomes the standard of care. And the standard of care itself actually shapes the type of person who sits behind this console. Because the type of person that sits behind this console in the interim will have been trained in the old way. But once this becomes the norm, you won't have somebody sitting there who's ever physically stood over a patient on his 2 feet. He'll always have been sitting there at the console, looking at the constituent parts through the viewfinder, never looking the patient in the eye, never seeing the body of the patient that he or she's operating on. Now the question is, what does that do to the physician's view of the patient and of life and of medicine in general? Does it change it? Does it, and how does it change it? Does it give them a different perspective? When a physician calls on a patient with one of these, does it change things? And does it, I would think it has to change the way that the patient looks at the physician. Now it was interesting, they did a patient satisfaction survey on these robots here. And they found that the patients do much prefer to see their own doctor's face on the video. But other than that, it's still pretty impersonal when you think about it. Lewis Thomas, and this is the quote that I actually start that paper with, when he wrote, he was the president of Memorial Sloan Kettering. And he wrote a book called The Youngest Science about medicine. He said, if I were a medical student or an intern just getting ready to begin, I would be apprehensive that my real job, caring for sick people, might soon be taken away, leaving one with the quite different occupation of looking after machines. And that's really what we're winding up doing. looking after machines. Now, when I researched this with physicians, I had a base group of 542 physicians that I looked at over a period of 10 years. And it was really kind of funny because when I told the anthropology department at SMU, I had 10 years worth of data. They said, well, you really need to write that down as 5 years worth of data because nobody's going to believe that you have 10 years worth of data. But I did. And what I found, I think, based on a lot of the changes that have occurred technically in medicine, was a change in the motivational factor for becoming a doctor. And these were some of the parameters that I looked at to arrive at motivational factors of altruism, intellectual stimulation, economic security, and social position in medicine. And in altruism, there were more than these, but these were the important ones. Something like a positive influence of a role model or a mentor who was a physician, a desire to help human beings, interest in curing an illness that was based on a family member who had this illness, and sometimes religious motivation. And intellectual, usually people who like to put puzzles together. You know, I like the intellectual stimulation. I want something that's difficult and intellectually challenging. I like competition. I'm analytical. I'm interested in the little intricacies of the human body. And then economic. I want a future career in a medically based industry that works with medicine, but not necessarily is medicine, like the pharmaceutical industry. You actually have some that said that. I want career stability. I want to be rewarded for what I do. I want to work in a business with medicine, and I want to make a lot of money. Those are there too. Social was I come from a family of doctors, and they expect me to be a doctor. I ran into that several times. People think I'm intelligent, have a great deal of social prestige. I'll be a big fish in a small pond. My mother and my father was a physician, and I feel the social pressure to do that. And it's a vocation with a fair degree of esteem. Well, what were the results when I questioned doctors who were educated prior to 1980? Economic and social were very low on the scale, but intellectual and altruism came out to be the main reasons why they became physicians. Now, somebody questioned me on this. What if they were lying? You know, what if they gave you a doctor lie? But
This was all self-report?
yeah. And my question back was, well, why did they feel the compulsion to have to lie? You know, why did they feel like they had to make up an altruistic reason?
It sounds better.
Yeah, sure.
Self-deception.
It makes them look
Yeah.
good.
Yes.
Sure, that makes them feel better about
And
themselves.
so there's at least some sort of a road back to an altruistic reason here. But if you question medical students, same questions. And I separated them out male and female. Altruism comes out a little bit lower. Intellectual is still fairly high total. Social is much bigger. And economic is more important. And when I drilled down on the economic, it's not so much I want to be rich as I thought it would be. It's I want to have a career that has stability, where I will always be a doctor, I'll always be employable. Nobody can fire me. And so when I showed this to a group of medical students, it was funny, I went back and forth. I said, if you're going into the ER, for instance, who would you rather have treat you? This guy
Yeah.
or this guy? Because patient outcomes really haven't changed all that much, all that dramatically. But what governs patient outcomes has changed.
Did you look at male and female
Yeah, and I did a t-test on it just to see if there were any significant difference between the two, and there weren't.
How about foreign medical students studying in American medical school?
My sample was kind of a mixture, but it was very small, and so I didn't have a big enough number to determine, is that gonna make a huge difference? And it's something that needs to be looked at. But it's definitely different. The governor here, I think, was this motivation, this altruism. That's what was keeping him honest. Here it's the legal profession. I'm afraid I'm gonna get sued into oblivion. And so I do all these extra tests that I
Student loans.
yeah, student loan. And it's also interesting the way they diagnose. These people diagnose an illness using their five senses, the way that they were taught to do it. And the only reason they'd order a test is to confirm what their five senses have already told them. These people order a test right off the bat so that they could get a diagnosis, because they don't know what it is.
Except that a lot of these managed care outfits severely restrict testing. They're looking very carefully at the test the doctor is ordering.
It varies from area to area. But if you're in a very litigious area, for instance, in the Northeast, like Boston, where you have to drive for 2 hours to find a person to deliver a baby, they're going to do every test that they can. And this is just an item analysis looking at medical students and practicing physicians and their reasons for becoming a physician. And it wasn't an all or nothing thing. There was a little bit of altruism for everybody. It might have been microscopic, but it was still there. But another interesting thing too is when you look at the effect of mentors on them. Why did you go into the specialty that you came into? I looked at a lot of different specialties, and one of the things that got my attention is when I came to colorectal surgeons. I thought, I was thinking, okay, you take a fourth-year medical student, and you explain to them what a colorectal surgeon does for a living. And you don't get a lot of people saying, hey, sign me up.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do. But if they attach themselves to a person who does that, and that person, along the lines of the Hippocratic Oath, becomes like a father to them, I will consider him dear to me as my father who taught me this art. And they make that specialty look so interesting and so vital that they have to do it. And so you see that the mentors had a significant influence on them. Very few of them said they didn't have any influence at all. So it was, and this is one of the things, I'm not sure if we may be losing this right here, because you see a different animal going into medical school today. And I don't know if they need that mentor relationship. Some of them still do. Some of them still get it. But not all of them do. And so when I look at this overall, I see the individual physician embedded in an institution that uses technology, but is embedded in the broader culture. And what I've seen is that the changes that we saw occur in physicians in terms of their motivations are just a reflection of what's occurring in the culture at large. So consequently, one of the things I discussed in that paper, I was talking to a nephrologist, a friend of mine who's a professor in Chicago. And there's a practice that goes on in medical school called pimping. And you're supposed to learn everything by memory that you're supposed to know. What's the Kreb cycle? Tricarboxylic acid cycle. Repeat it for me. How do we get carbon? And they're supposed to know that. Repeat it over and over again. And they'll stop them in the hall. Okay, give me the Kreb cycle. And they'll answer that. And then they'll ask them another question. They'll keep asking the questions until they get one they don't know. And then they belittle them. Well, that's pimping. Well, today's medical students don't put up with that because they don't want to do it, and they also have their iPad there, and if they need to know anything, they can look it up really quickly, so they don't have to memorize it. And my friend says, what happens when the Wi-Fi goes out and you're in an emergent situation and you can't look it up? It has to be right up there. So that's gonna change a few things.
When was the last time someone needed in the field to know the Kreb cycle?
Oh, the Kreb Cycle is just a pain in the butt.
I know, I mean, I think that's,
But nobody
It's
needs to
hazing.
know that. Yeah, it is hazing, and it's medical degree by ordeal.
yes.
But then they come along and they put other things in, okay, cardiac failure, what are the steps that you take, and they put that in with it. And it used to be a system, I had to go through it, so you have to go through it, one of those. Everybody gets an enema. And we're losing that primarily because the cultural expectations have changed. And I see this creeping into medical school where we're getting technicians and not physicians. We're getting people that are technically amazing, but they don't appreciate the fact that they're operating on a human being, or that they're doing their work on a human being. They're almost not in the true clinical sense of the word, but they're almost socially autistic when it comes to doctor-patient interactions. In fact, there was one of the references I have on there, and this is back as long ago as 1994, article in the Lancet, where two Canadian physicians recommended that British doctors take as part of their curriculum acting classes so that they can act like they care. And they were serious. They were really serious. So it's the questions that this brought up, if the motivational factors have changed, is it going to affect the quality of patient care? So far, I don't think it has all that greatly, but again, we have a legal system that makes sure that it doesn't. And the other question, have aspects of patient care changed in a positive manner? Surely technology has done something for us. I mean, it's given us things that we haven't had before. The promise of genetics now to be able to create a treatment for cancer after we have sequenced the genome of the cancer and been able to inject that back into the patient and put a telomere on the end of that genetic sequence and tell it to stop replicating. Right there, we'll be able to do that sooner rather than later. That's amazing. And then what aspects of patient care have changed in a negative way? What have we done that's bad? And is there anything that we can do to prevent that? And if the role of mentor is declining, and I put fictive kinship, I wrote an article about fictive kinship in biomedicine. They're like fathers to these medical students. If this is changing, why is it changing, and is there anything that's going to take its place? Do you have these deep relationships in medical school, or are we educating a bunch of independent contractors who are just technicians now? And so will we ever come back to this idea of the doctor, the famous painting by Sir Luke Fielding that was inspired by a doctor actually treating his son of pneumonia? And will we get back to the ideas of Osler, who said quite incorrectly, medicine is not a business and it can never be one, because we cannot treat our fellow creatures as we treat corn or coal.
Oops.
Mm-hmm. But I think Ambrose Bierce was right. Physician is one upon whom we set our hopes when ill and our dogs when well. And in my own PhD way, thus endeth another series.
I think just last week, we got this thing, a little thing you could put on your car, like teledoc.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I'm
Okay.
like, it kind of scares me, but I've never used it. Has anybody used something like
I've
that
used it.
before? And,
It was on a weekend, and our doctor was in Europe,
oh, good.
and so we used Teladoc. And Jeannie was able to get, she had a throat infection.
Prescription medicine.
And got a prescription.
Wow.
Cost us $10.
Wow. That's
And your
interesting.
insurance covered?
Yeah.
It's your insurance, our insurance. Teledoc, we just got this.
I got it in the mail, but I didn't see that it was connected to our insurance.
It is, it's part, it's, the what's our insurance, Blue Cross?
Maddy.
Blue Cross or something, yeah.
Yeah, when I
But I
first
didn't,
saw
I didn't know if
it,
anybody used it. so-
when I first saw it, it said Teladoc, I thought it was for psychiatry.
Yeah, yeah, we have that counseling online.
Don't want that.
Mhm.
What, which one, I mean, who hasn't been influenced by a mentor in this room? I mean, we all kinda
Oh, yeah.
did the same thing as the medicine. I mean,
Sure.
it's.
Every
happen.
profession
Yeah.
has, in fact, just about every person has to
Right.
one degree or another, but there's I've met some of these medical students that are, they're an example of an article that was written in the Atlantic Monthly years ago by David Brooks called The Organization Kid. And he said he followed a freshman class at Princeton. He said these kids have been programmed to make straight A's, make all the right moves, get the perfect resume, and get into just the right graduate school, whether that's medical school or what. And they're there now in medical school. They schedule their personal time in 15-minute increments. Yeah, I can have coffee with you, but after 15 minutes, I gotta go someplace else, so you're out of luck. And that's the way that they view life. And life is just a series of events to go through, and they don't get particularly close to anybody. And if this,
How's that not like graduate school?
I think medical, my son's best friend Jason, and that's who he roomed with for 3 years at college, is a medical student, yeah.
Mhm.
Straight A's, he is the perfect roommate, because after the football game, he would go study. So I liked him living with my son. Some of it rubbed off. But I saw Jason, after his first year in medical school. I said, how's it going? He goes, well, I'll be honest. I was the valedictorian at Plano, one of those Plano East schools, straight A's. And he got straight A's in college. And he said, I was always the top of my class. But now in medical school, everybody's the top of the class. So I
Sure.
said, it's harder. But he's making it. He's in third year now. He's doing real well. But, it's harder. It's
Job
harder.
satisfaction in medicine isn't
Yeah.
real high, but
Mhm.
in 1900, average life expectancy was 47.1
Sure.
years. Now it's 88.8
For everyone or just doctors?
for everyone.
For everyone.
Okay.
For everyone.
So we're doing something, this method.
Yeah.
That's
Well, what's
more.
interesting though, it's, if you look worldwide, life expectancy in the UK is actually about a year higher than it is here. They don't use as many antibiotics as we do. They don't do as many bypass surgeries as we do. And they don't do as much heroic intervention as we do.
Lifestyle, though?
Some of it's probably lifestyle.
Norway's got a high one too, but it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
We
They
live
have
here.
socialized. Norway, England has
Yeah.
socialized medicine. We don't.
Yeah.
Well, England is going to a system where they're getting more private insurance now.
Oh,
They
right.
used to just have the National Health
And now it's
Service.
plus. Okay.
And now some employers to attract more highly skilled employees are offering private insurance.
In 1900, we didn't have the population we have now. And now that we're living older, we have Alzheimer's, we have
Oh, yeah.
dementia, we have bladder issues and a lot of cancers
An awful
that
lot.
didn't exist in 1900. So
Because you didn't live long enough to
you
get
didn't
it.
live to
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Exactly.
Yeah, because early childhood killed most.
Yes.
50%.
Oh, yeah.
I'd say 50% didn't
Yeah.
live
So it's a mix.
Yeah, the mortality rate, infant mortality rate
Infants.
was unbelievable.
So if you,
back then.
if you have all that population and you have all
Mhm.
the span, like, what are you gonna do when you reach 65? Because you've got another 20 years to go. You better have a whole bunch of doctors, and how do you get them if you don't make use of the
It's
technology?
difficult. They, the statisticians that I talk to say that we could use another 35,000 doctors tomorrow. You know, and
Yeah.
tomorrow would be just fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, but you don't have the students like your
Yeah, Jason.
Jason. Yeah.
Well, it's like I was talking to a group of medical students, you know, what you call the guy who graduated last in his class in medical school, doctor.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, if you had the opportunity to create a medical school like Plato, recreating Athens,
Mhm.
what would you like to see in a medical school to correct what you see as clearly not a healthy trend? Is it correctable? And should it be corrected? Because in light of what you just said, it seems to be helping more than hurting.
Well, it's helping
just different.
statistically.
Yeah.
You know, are you, and I don't know if there's a correlation between quantity and quality, you know, necessarily in what we're getting. But in answer to your question, it would probably be the same thing that Osler said. Right here, they ask him, what is a good background for a medical education? And how should you prepare? And he said, a person who's going to be a good doctor should have a good liberal arts education. They should be educated in the great books of the world. They should be educated in aesthetics and be able to appreciate beauty. And they should be able to read and write well. And just everything that
And then go to
classical
college.
education.
I know, and so that's not gonna help.
No, it's never gonna happen.
Yeah.
But he asked me what the
Yeah,
perfect,
no, that's good.
you know,
But there are
good-
medical schools who at least claim to be looking for such people.
Well, that's all they do.
I mean,
is
all
they
things
claim.
being equal, they will
Yeah.
take the English major over the chemistry major, all things being equal.
All things being
Medical
equal,
school?
yeah,
I don't know.
but I was talking to a person who shall remain nameless, but he's a big kahuna at a medical school in the state of Texas, and he was advising the son of one of his colleagues who was trying to get into medical school, and he had aced the MCAT, the Medical College Admissions Test. And it was time for him to write his essay. And he was going to go to apply at a Northeast school. He said, whatever you do in your essay, don't tell them you want to become a doctor because you want to help people. So tell them you want to become a doctor because you will make a valuable contribution to society in terms of your social stability and your economic contribution to the community.
So that's how the environment has changed the doctor, not,
Mhm.
you know, not
Yeah.
someone's value system that
Right.
they learned from their parents or.
Mm-hmm.
That's also the committee, that's the.
Yeah, it was
that's
like-
the admissions committee's
Committee.
making,
Yeah, and it was
shaping
like,
our doctors.
it was like boiling a
15
toad, you
seconds.
know, it happened
Ah.
degree by degree.
It's like saying, why do you want to become a teacher? Because I want to improve the student experience. I want to improve the learning experience, which is code for the customer.
Right.
Experience.
People
Yeah.
say that?
Yeah, it's all the Harvard Business School model.
Oh.
No.
But,
Do you believe the pimping method of hazing is to the benefit of students?
I don't think so
Very
personally.
good.
I don't like it, but I've talked to so many doctors that said that
That's all we know.
that's all we know, you know.
Yeah,
Like,
psychological abuse is not,
there's
It's not
a,
strengthening people.
there's a physician that is still teaching at UT Southwestern named Donald Selden. Bless you, he's 95 years old, and he was the head of internal medicine. And he was actually a witness at the Nuremberg trials as a medical expert. He's a very smart guy. He's from the Bronx, New York, and he was trained at Yale. And the reason that UT Southwestern looks so much like Yale, when you look at their system is because of him. And there is an apocryphal story, which I found it was absolutely true because I talked to 3 of the people that were involved. And this was back in the 60s when he was actively teaching, taking students around on rounds. He had 6 of them that were assigned to him. And one patient had been assigned to this one student, and the patient had expired over the night. And so they go in and they look at the chart, and he pulls all the students into an empty room, and they're reviewing the chart, what the 4th-year student had done to the patient. Selden looks at it, he's flipping over the pages, throws the chart on the bed, walks to the door, opens it up, says, "Get me a police officer, it's been a murder." Just like that.
Yeah.
And another physician that I know who's a rheumatologist that was on Selden's service was working the ER. A patient comes in, he's in cardiac arrest, and so the first thing they do is they get a cardiac needle and they give him a shot of saline solution, sodium bicarb. So they gave him sodium bicarb and he died. Well, I forgot to check to see if maybe he was diabetic, which he was, and that killed him. So he had to call Selden and tell him what happened. He said, "Dr. Selden, I did this test, I did that test, and unfortunately we didn't do a blood glucose test, and the sodium bicarb reacted and the patient expired." And Selden goes, "Well, you killed him." Just like that. And that was the norm. You know, I've heard stories of students that would come into the lounge trying to rejoice in something that they had just learned in one of their classes, and Selden would say, "Please spare us your brilliance." So it's you know, you have some that love it. I can't see where it really accomplished anything other than demeaning.
Is this a romantic approach, this idea of the touch of the patient, laying of the hands?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's interesting. Sherwin Millen, before he died, he was working on a project that would be good for somebody to finish. That he called the goodness of the physician. The curative powers of the goodness of the physician. And how sometimes, and a good example of this was Osler himself. He was called in to see the son of one of the faculty at Oxford when he was called to be Regis Professor over there. And it was graduation time, and he had his robes on for graduation. He was going to stop in and see the kid real quickly. The kid had bronchitis and whooping cough. In 1906, that was the death sentence. So he goes in to see him, and he asked the professor, "Could you bring me some fruit? Do you have like a peach?" And he did. And Osler cut it up for him and fed it to him. And as he's leaving, he tells the professor, he said, "I don't think he's going to make it another week." But the boy started to get better. And he said, "The wizard that you sent," because he had the robes on.
Yes, sir. The child
helped-
said.
Yeah, helped me. The wizard did. So every time Osler would see him, he'd put his robes on to go out and see him. And within 4 weeks, the kid was well. And that's an example of
Coincidence?
No, positive.
Positive, you know, that.
Yeah. You think you're gonna get better, you're gonna get better.
Yeah, what was it, it was like
You
40
have,
years.
you have a hole in your lung. I don't think thinking is going to make it.
Whooping cough
Right.
is a death sentence in 1906.
Yeah,
Well,
30 years
It's not a
Maybe now.
probability statement, it's actually.
Well, 30 years ago, there was a book that was written by Kenneth Pelletier at Stanford called "Mind is Slayer, Mind is Healer." And he went a little overboard, but a large portion of disease it's got a huge psychological component in it that affects our immune system. You know, the chaplain at Yale years ago was a guy named William Sloane Coffin. horrible name for a chaplain. And,
Or doctor.
Or
Yeah,
doctor,
or
yeah.
doctor. It's like the hospital in Dallas, RH Dead Man.
Yeah.
Ooh,
We
ooh.
call it RHD. But Kaufman, he'd been in the OSS during the Second World War. He had, then he, got his divinity degree at Harvard, and he participated in civil rights marches. He was always getting arrested and stuff like that. And he had been arrested down in Mississippi in the early 60s, and he came back to Yale with horrible pneumonia. And they looked at his chest film, one whole lung was white. And they thought they were going to do a thoracotomy on him, where they open up his chest and basically just scrape out all the pus and infection. Very painful and very dangerous. And his doctor came in to see him, and he scheduled the surgery for, I think he said a Thursday, because he operated on Thursdays and Fridays. He went in to see him on Wednesday, and he sounded a little bit better. And he said, well, let's put the surgery off one day and see him the next day. Next day sounded a little bit better, and a little bit better, a little bit better. He said he got well, and he went home. And the surgeon that was working with him lost track of him for about 2 months, sees him at a wedding, and says, I've got to know, how did you get work? He said, I did it for Bizazero. And he said, what? He said, couldn't understand what he said. He said, I did it for Bizazero. So what do you mean? He said, the intern that was working on me, Joe Bizazero, he came to see me every day, and he wanted me to get well, and I couldn't let him down.
Well, the narrative is stuff of fairy tales.
Oh, sure it is.
You can
But-
document though, you can
Yeah,
say
you can.
the human will is strong,
Mhm.
the human will is strong. And like when you have stress, it diverts energy away from the white blood cells, you can
Yeah.
track it, right? I mean,
You
you
can,
can check.
and you can show immune suppression
Yeah,
and
You
things
can
like
show
that.
it.
Yeah.
there you go.
But, yeah.
But does this happen every day? No, of course it doesn't happen every day. But there is an aspect of, I think, of the goodness of the physician that probably ought to be looked at and maybe explored. And if we can teach it, maybe we ought to teach it.
Give the white rose.
It's like giving a dead man an enema. It couldn't hurt.
Oh,
They
who
modified-
said that?
They modified the AIDS programs in a lot of places to include, of course, an
It couldn't hurt.
You're even involved in that.
It's a
Mark,
visual,
even though
I don't
it's
wanna do
not
that.
at the level, right? It would be possible, you would think it would be possible to institute some type of seminar in a medical school. It could take all different forms. Illness is a metaphor, for example. It
Oh,
can take
yeah.
all different forms. However, there is so much they have to learn, you know?
Oh, I know.
That
And-
the first knee-jerk reaction would be, no way.
Yeah, we
Did
don't
they-
have
Did they
time.
have the time for this?
Well, at the end of 4 years, yeah, it's like they say, half of everything that we teach you is wrong, we just don't know which half. And that's.
It's
the
like
way
at
it is.
Rice a few years ago, they instituted the humanities requirement for all the engineers. And it lasted, with the greatest of intentions, and it lasted a very few number of years. And as soon as the president who had instituted it left, that left. All right. And so much for making engineers humanists, teaching them to write and so forth. And the argument against keeping the requirement was, there's so much they have to learn in electrical engineering. What's better, a competent engineer or a semi-competent engineer who's read Aristotle?
Well, there's
That's right.
there's got to be some kind of happy medium. And
Yeah.
there's an example in the handout of a cardiologist friend of mine whose wife is legally blind. She had retinitis pigmentosa and lost all of her sight. And she had to go in for a knee replacement. And she's lying there in her bed with a drain coming out of the knee. And her daughter was sitting there, who's a physician assistant, a certified physician assistant, and actually has a PhD. And so she's sitting there, sitting up with her mom, and these two interns come in, resident and an intern. And they got her chart, and it's like 12 o'clock at night, or 12 o'clock in the morning. And they don't even say hi. They look at her chart, time for the drain to come out, snip it, pull it out, and she's blind. She can't see. And about flies to the moon, and her daughter came unglued, and of course her husband is on the faculty at that medical school, and you know, he gets a little bit PO'd and goes to see the head of the medical school, and he said, well, we don't want to make the interns mad or anything like that.
Oh.
And so now he just tells the story as an example of what not to do, because he teaches physical diagnosis. But, you know, for these two guys, apparently she was just a constituent part. You know,
16-hour shift.
Yeah, we're seeing a need.
But that's the institution changing these people who maybe would have taken a different course, but
Sure.
they have four more floors to do
Mm-hmm.
by 8 a.m.
Yeah, and it's, and medical schools are for-profit institutions.
Surprise, surprise.
So when the root of all evil is there.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.